You're listening to the Mind Over Murder podcast.
My name is Bill Thomas. I'm a writer, consulting producer, and now podcaster. I am now trying to use my experience as the brother of a murder victim to help other victims of violent crime. I'm working on a book on the unsolved Colonial Parkway Murders, and I'm the co-administrator of the Colonial Parkway Murders Facebook group, together with Kristin Dilley.
My name is Kristin Dilley. I'm a writer, a researcher, a teacher, and a victims advocate, as well as the social media manager and co-administrator for the Colonial Parkway Murders Facebook page with my partner in crime, Bill Thomas. Welcome to Mind Over Murder. I'm Kristin Dilley.
And I'm Bill Thomas.
And we're joined today by Dr. Michael Baden, one of the most preeminent forensic pathologists in the true crime space. Dr. Baden, we are thrilled and honored to have you here. Thank you for joining us.
Great to be here.
Start by telling us about your extensive professional background. I know that's a tall order, but see if you can do it in just a couple of sentences for us.
Started out, I was a graduate of the City College of New York and NYU Medical School. Did an internship residency program at Bellevue Hospital in New York City, first in internal medicine, then in pathology, and just by accident, because the New York City Medical Examiner's Office was located in the basement of Bellevue Hospital, I became interested in autopsies that were done every day in the basement at Bellevue, and learned a great deal of information about people. It's an amazing thing what autopsies can tell you. And eventually changed from internal medicine to pathology, began working first on a moonlighting basis for the medical examiner's office in New York City, going to scenes of death and doing autopsies on weekends and holidays, and became a full-time medical examiner and worked there for 25 years doing in various capacities, including that of chief medical examiner in New York. Then after 25 years, I switched to the New York State Police and was the chief forensic pathologist for the New York State Police, which had death cases throughout the 62 counties of New York. And recently retired, and I'm doing a private forensic pathology and fascinated every time I do an autopsy. It's like a miracle to see how trillions of cells line up to give us hearts and lungs and nerves. How do cells know where they go? It's, I think, more each autopsy and looking into the body is more fascinating than looking out to outer space and seeing a few suns that are going to explode or something like that. But the human body each one of us is a miracle as far as the autopsy table goes.
So that we've got our terminology right. And I realized going into this that I don't have the terminology right. Can you explain the difference between a forensic pathologist, a coroner, and a medical examiner? Because I can't tell the difference between the three. No, so please help us out.
That's interesting because it's a confusing history. Way back in England, a coroner system was developed because even in the 12th century when it developed, when somebody died, there had to be some accounting to how the death occurred, especially in England, because if somebody committed suicide, the law was, you're not allowed to commit suicide because then I lose a troop for an army, and all of that individual's property would go over to the king. So the main thing was picking up suicide so they could confiscate that individual's remains. And in 1619, and from then on in the United States, in the early part of that time, we inherited that coroner system, was called, in England, after coroner started out as crowner. It was an officer of the crown. In fact, if one goes to Hamlet, when Hamlet comes upon the graveyard scene and asks how come they're burying You're using a church burial for somebody who drowned, and they say, because the crowner, they still use a term in 1599 when Hamlet is written, as crowner, and has determined that she didn't go to the water, but the water came to her, therefore it's not suicide. And that's still how it works in our business, and is that crowners and the development from crowners in the 19th century, late 19th century, was somebody figured out in Maryland and first in New York that the person who should be able to determine the cause of death should be a physician, because they should know what the medical terms are. Medical examiners sprouted up in some jurisdictions where the person in charge of determining cause and manner of death is a physician. Some places say there has to be a physician who specializes in deaths, which is the pathologist. Presently, about half the United States counties are coroner counties and half are medical examiner counties. The difference is coroners, going back to our British roots, can be anyone of age, now 18 or 21 years old, who is a citizen and is elected. Coroners are elected and in most places need no experience except being a citizen. And that's half the United States is run that way. And half are medical examiners. Medical examiners are appointed by the county to, and most medical examiners have to be physicians or have medical professionals. And in some places like New York City, the person has to be a forensic pathologist, because a forensic pathologist is the one who is trained in unnatural death. Coroners, I said, are elected and medical examiners appointed based on merit. To be a medical examiner is a political appointment. A medical examiner is the person in charge. In the old Quincy series on television, Quincy was the forensic pathologist, and there was a lawyer who was the coroner in charge. So Quincy was a medical examiner, and his boss was a coroner who was a lawyer. Even now, California is unique, where most medical examiners are appointed by the coroner, who is a sheriff. And that's pretty much mostly in California. And that's the difference. There have been some, in New York State, there's 62 counties, of which about 18 are medical examiners are in charge, and the rest are elected coroners. One of the reasons I was asked to be in charge of forensic as the medical examiner for the state police was that in many of the counties they work in, there are coroners who are elected who aren't trained in how to learn from the dead body that the forensic pathologist has to. So they established a forensic science division where I could then be active in all the counties and help the coroners. So because the state police were losing cases because of bad autopsies at that time. Now, as far as pathologists go, pathology is one of the specialties in medicine, and most pathologists are hospital pathologists who work in hospitals and run the laboratories and do autopsies as necessary, and examine the biopsies that are taken to see if it's cancer or not cancer, for example. And a pathologist doesn't really deal with living people. They deal with other doctors who are living, but not patients. Yeah. So the hospital pathologist deals with other physicians. I always liked, when I worked part-time in the medical examiner's office, the contact with the family members and of the people that were being examined, autopsies, or when I went to the scene, going to scenes of death. The autopsy starts at the scene of death. That's where we learn how long the person has been dead. We'll find out if they have any pre-existing illnesses, what medicines they're on, and how long they've been dead, and whether or not an autopsy should be done. And that's by talking to the family members and getting more information. That's how medical examiners and coroners differ.
Wow.
Without trying to be too pointed about it, Dr. Baden, it sounds like in a lot of places around the United States, people that don't sound terribly qualified are acting as coroners. They're not doctors, they're not trained medical examiners, and yet they're supposed to determine how a particular person died?
Yes, and that is a deficiency. We're still working in half the counties in the United States with a system that was established in the 1800s, the 1700s, when the United States was first developed. It sounds very anachronistic. From time to time, there's an attempt made to change coroner systems to medical examiner systems. I was involved with that once in New York State. When I was in the New York City medical examiner's office, there was a movement to change all the 62 counties in New York State to medical examiner counties and eliminate all of the coroner counties, where many of them were truck drivers. And the two most in common are funeral directors. They're the ones that make up most of the biggest coroner system gathering. And they're usually bright people with no medical knowledge, but they know how to deal with people. They know how to deal with the families. And when there was a bill put up in the New York State legislature to change the medical examiner's state medical examiner system, thousands of coroner supporters from the counties got buses to go to Albany to protest.
Wow.
Because one of the things about being elected a coroner is you have a base of people who are friends to you.
Right.
And if the coroner acts properly, some doctors are not very good with people, and that could be upsetting to people if they're not. Funeral directors are trained, and they're very good in relating to people and making them feel better at a time of grief. And that was demonstrated to me with the failed attempt to change things in New York State. So I think they're going to be with us. There are courses for coroners, and most coroners, many coroners, not all, will work out a relationship with a nearby forensic pathologist to do autopsies, for which they pay them a certain amount of fee for each per case fee.
There is a whole hidden history to this that I had no idea about. How interesting.
When one goes into the accuracy of what death certificates, a lot of mistakes made on death certificates. Occasionally they come out. Usually they come out when somebody prominent dies, and that's because there's an interest in them. Most people who die, the cause of death is often just a guess. And then this goes into vital statistics. So it becomes an issue as to how common certain diseases are and how we miss certain things. And that's what happens really with the police deaths in police custody, is that there's a great deal of underreporting of deaths in police encounters. One of the reasons I wrote this book.
Yeah, so let's go ahead and jump into that. So you've written a new book called American Autopsy. It's really fascinating. There's a whole array of issues that came up in the book that I had never really taken into consideration before. But I really enjoyed reading it. Tell us about the premise of the book and then why you felt it was so imperative to write this book now.
I've been concerned since I started out as a medical examiner about the unevenness as in death determination in this country, partly because of the lack of training, many people, especially coroners, in making decisions. But it became more apparent to me that when I was started as a medical examiner, that we were supposed to be especially careful in determining cause of death in people who die in police encounters. And this became very apparent when I became chief medical examiner. About a month or two after I became chief medical examiner, there was a citizen named Arthur Miller, a Black citizen that the mayor today, Mayor Adams, referred to in a celebration of his life, 50 years death or so, that he was the first I can't breathe person. I was a chief medical examiner. Arthur Miller was a businessman in Brooklyn, very friendly with police, very good in the community, comes home one day and sees a crowd around his brother and police. Apparently the police wanted to give him a summons for improperly getting rid of garbage. And they were around him. He came up and he put his arms up to tell the community to get back and see how he could stop the commotion. But one of the police officers saw that he had a gun on. It was a legal gun that he was with a permit to take because he, as a businessman, had carried a lot of money around from time to time. So it was legal, but the police didn't know that, and they immediately jumped on him, got him down on the ground, was heard to say, "I can't breathe." That's why Mayor Adams refers back to him in that thing. And gets in the police car, goes to the precinct. By the time he gets to the precinct, he's dead. The autopsy is done by the Brooklyn medical examiner because that's where death occurred. I was a chief. I called up and asked what the findings were. And he said, it looks like he died of psychosis with exhaustion. I said, what do you mean? I said, that's what we always say when people die and they're excited and they die while being subdued by police, that somehow the adrenal glands are putting out too much adrenaline. It's the fault of the person who dies, not the fault of the police. And I say, any damage to his neck? Yeah, there's a fracture in the Adam's apple, little hemorrhages, petechiae in the eyes. I said, wasn't that typical of neck compression? And he said, yes, but we don't put that down. So I said, we're going to put it down now. And this is my just starting out. And he put down, cause of death was compression of neck at that time, much like Floyd's neck. And that was a homicide because death had another. I got a call from the mayor, extremely upset, Mayor Koch, that he was getting a hassle from police and saying, no, we're not supposed to do that. I said, but the truth is the truth. And that was what led to my being demoted from chief to deputy chief medical examiner after about a year that I was there. In the office, is because back in 1979, this is saying that the police caused a death. And this is around the country the same way. There's a lot of pushback for medical examiners to say that the police caused the death. And that got me thinking a lot beginning there about how the autopsy situation can lead to misdiagnoses. And as soon as the medical examiner says that it's not a homicide, that it's a psychosis with exhaustion or excited delirium, which then came after that, no more investigation. And when I start the book out, when I got a call from the family of George Floyd that they wanted me to do a second autopsy because the first autopsy, the medical examiner and district attorney had come out right after the first, this is about 3 or 4 days after he died, came out and said that the police restraint had nothing to do with George Floyd's death. And I had seen the same photographs that everybody else saw, with the taken by a 15-year-old girl, with the officer's knee pressing on the neck, his saying, I can't breathe,
right,
and dying. And it reminded me so much of Arthur Miller that this has been going on from 1979 to 2020, that I decided I should write something about it and how to prevent it. That it's it isn't a bad apple. It's a structural thing.
What kind of conversation, if any, goes on behind the scenes, Dr. Baden, when you've got mayors and police chiefs and the heads of police unions and other people, the pressure on the medical professionals to push their analysis in a direction that exonerates the police has to be tremendous. What's said behind the scenes?
What's behind the scenes is two things. One is that when we grow up as medical examiners, we are in everyday contact with the police because the medical examiner in training and the medical examiner throughout life deals every day with police who come down to identify decedents and to give information. We develop, I think, a bias toward our friends, and that when a death occurs, even the good forensic pathologists, and there aren't that many around, there are less than 400 or 500 full-time forensic pathologists in the whole country. Medical examiners see the police usually as good guys, and that they didn't wake up in the morning wanting to kill somebody, and that when the people die in police encounters by asphyxia during the restraint process, by pressing on the back, trying to handcuff somebody from behind, causes the abdominal organs to push up into the chest and prevents the diaphragms from going up and down so that we can't breathe. And that's why Arthur Miller and so many others have said, I can't breathe, because the diaphragms won't go down. In order to inhale, our diaphragm has to go down. And you and I, as we're sitting here, our diaphragms are going up and down about 18 times in a minute. We have nothing to do with it. It's the small, thin muscle that gets no respect. It's not like the biceps or triceps. Is what keeps us alive from birth to death. That keeps our lungs going in and out and inhaling and exhaling air. When that stopped, most often by police officers who are pressing on the back to get the wrists together to put on handcuffs and somebody who's resisting, the person can't breathe and dies and leaves no marks on the body. See, there's no marks in the body like with George Floyd, when the medical examiner and prosecutor said that there's nothing at the autopsy to show that he died because of the police restraint. Doctors knew that was nonsense because suffocation, death because of back pressure leaves no marks on the body. What did happen was that the one photograph that the 15-year-old girl got the Pulitzer Prize for, rightfully, that showed the knee on Floyd's neck, and while he was saying, I can't breathe, showed what everybody else knew, that this police that killed him. It wasn't due to the restraint. And the problem comes up is that various cause of death are put on the death certificate that washes over that cause of death. Things like excited delirium, things like undetermined, things like blaming low levels of drugs or heart disease that would not be a cause of death, hide the fact that excessive force was used. And that's what's leading to increasing division as exposed by the George Floyd incident.
You're listening to Mind Over Murder. We'll be right back after this word from our sponsors. We're back here at Mind Over Murder.
Yeah, nobody's going to put positional asphyxia on a death certificate as opposed to some other thing where they can say, oh, it was, what did you call it, psychotic delirium?
Psychosis with exhaustion was the old term.
Yeah.
Now it's excited delirium.
Excited delirium.
Okay. All of that says that it's not the fault of the police officer. That goes down as natural deaths. End of case.
Wow.
And I think George Floyd exposed how the diagnosis by the medical examiner can immediately halt any type of investigation, because if the medical examiner says a death is not homicide, it's accident or suicide or natural, that ends the police investigation. And that results in families that have been very upset over the years. And also the great undercounting of deaths. The Washington Post has, because there's no governmental reporting of deaths caused by police. And the problem is, in part, demonstrated by the Washington Post by looking every day at newspaper reports, or have found over the past few years that there are about 1,000 deaths a year in this country that are caused by police shootings mostly. The state of Washington studied death certificates at the university and found that half of all deaths involving police are not mentioned on the death certificate in any way. It's usually such as by excited delirium and things like that. And so there are at least 2,000 deaths a year from police activity. And the only way to really get a handle on it and to try and develop strategies to prevent it is by having a national register of all these deaths. This was tried, I think, back around 2014 when there was some concern about police deaths. A law was passed, a federal law, to report all deaths voluntarily. It was by police departments, and it turned out just in December, the government, the IGO, the government agency that looks into these things, did a study and showed that very few counties, jurisdictions reported any deaths because it was voluntary. That has to be made mandatory. And then to be able to get a handle on where the deaths occur and how they can be prevented. Part of it and one of the things that occurred to me in my years, it's not a rotten apple thing.
Right.
It's a systemic thing. I'd done an autopsy, investigated a death 10 years before George Floyd in the same police precinct in Minneapolis.
Oh, wow.
Of a black male who had some mental impairment, but was shooting basketballs by himself in a YMCA that he belonged to. When somebody complained that he didn't like him being there, police came, hadn't done anything wrong, subdued him, caused his death. It was on a video camera. I came down to testify that, and the same medical examiner agreed. We both agreed that he died of police chest compression. As a result of the settlement after that case, they had to do a serious education of all the Minneapolis police, and every morning have things written to them about how compression of prevention of breathing can cause death. That was the same precinct as George Floyd was killed at, where not only did Chavez put his knee on the neck, but the other three officers protected were there and wouldn't let any of the bystanders help or obey what they said. You're killing him, caught on the video. It's hard to just educate. There has to be certain changes, like police getting rid of qualified immunity, which protects police from actions, special interpretations of the law.
It does sound like there needs to be a pretty significant amount of changes made, not only to here's how we treat police officers, like you mentioned, qualified immunity, but also just educating them on you can't put somebody in a chokehold. You can't put your knee into somebody's back and cut off their breathing. What would you say the most important changes are that need to be made to help police understand you cannot do this to a person, you will kill them?
I think that they know what it said, but they don't believe it. They think that they have the false impression that the black people have gathered superhuman strength and they're going to hurt the police officer. That's why they use massive force. Remember, all the deaths that occur in police custody usually have 2 or 3 police officers around putting on the handcuffs. And they're being punished for not immediately obeying, putting hands behind the back to be handcuffed. They're not a threat to anybody. A couple of important things. One is a high percentage of such encounters and deaths involve people who are in acute mental crisis. Acute mental crisis because they haven't taken their medicine for schizophrenia and they're acting bizarre, or they're high on a drug, methamphetamine or something. They're not a danger to something. They're running around nude in the street sometimes, no weapon on them. And they're driving a car that gets a minor violation, and when the police encounter them, instead of treating them gently, they get angry at them because they didn't obey them. The not obeying starts with put your hands behind your back. And if you don't do that you're now committed a criminal act. So even though you're called for, so one of the things that should happen, and some jurisdictions, a few are getting mental health workers to go out with police on calls for emotionally disturbed people. Police often know when they're getting called for an EDP, an emotionally disturbed person, because their infraction is running around nude or something. They're not holding up a bank or something. And they're not a danger to anybody, but police are not given time to talk to people. They come, if they take action against somebody, they have to put handcuffs on them. And then they bring them to the precinct or something. If the person doesn't like handcuffs, as often the mentally impaired people, the acute episodes, they don't even understand what the police are telling them. And they belong in a hospital, or not in a police precinct, and they get even more agitated when they're asked about the handcuffing. So there are ways to make certain rules. I think also what could happen is when the medical examiners do say that they died because of the compression, some kind of impairment, usually, in my experience, when it goes to, they're investigated by internally, and internal investigations usually find that they acted according to proper procedure. It's unfortunate that it happened, but that's the end of it. Or if it goes to a grand jury, the grand jury doesn't bring down any indictment. And that's because, as they say, a district attorney can indict a ham sandwich, and it also cannot indict a serial killer. The interesting thing, remember Breonna lady in Kentucky?
Oh, Breonna Taylor, yeah.
Breonna Taylor, who was shot perfectly innocent. And when it's put in the grand jury, they didn't come down with an indictment. And finally, one of the grand jurors broke their oath and said, we didn't do anything because the district attorney just didn't ask us to do anything about indicting her. The grand jury in this country is secret because that's the way it used to be in 1776 when we established the British systems. In 1930s, Britain got rid of the secret grand jury. Anything that goes to the criminal justice investigation has to be made public. Breonna Taylor, still to this day, I think one of the officers' wrist was slapped because one of the bullets went into the next apartment.
Right.
But not because it was killed. And that there's no need. The grand jury itself is a place where deaths in police custody disappear.
Right.
So that's if the police know that they're going to be held responsible, if the prosecutor knows it, if there's a national database where cases are reviewed, somebody looking over their shoulder, that'll go a long way to diminishing outrageous behavior.
Do you think things can be changed for the better? Certainly, we've seen a lot of cases in the last couple of years where people have died at the hands of police in a way that looks excessive. As we discussed, George Floyd, Michael Brown, other people saying, I can't breathe, and they're being restrained by 3, 4, 5 officers. Can we make the systemic changes that we need to?
I think there's been slow progress. Things aren't as bad in the criminal justice system from a racial point of view as they were around the time of the Civil War. We've gradually made some back and forth progress. And I think there can be absolutely an improvement in police obeying proper directions and proper orders if they knew there was somebody looking into each case. That would be a national database, would be able to look into each case as appropriate and take action, whatever is decided, if they find that there's some place or some person that's repeatedly doing things, or if there has to be some kind of punishment for improper actions. The problem with the police unions is that a lot of good things they do, but there's a lot of things that they do that's to protect the membership. And unfortunately, some members take advantage of that.
As the English teacher in the room, I do have to ask, what is your writing process like? Because you have such a wide range of expertise and you've had such a storied career. How in the world do you figure out what you're going to put in one book? There is so much to American Autopsy. How in the world do you go about your writing process?
Part of it, I've tried a few books before, but to show how a medical examiner develops and the usual kind of cases. But with George Floyd, it brought me down to concentrate on deaths during police encounters and the failures, not only of police and prosecutors, which have been discussed in the New York Times editorials, but also the failures in my business among medical examiners. There's a reluctance to say that a death is caused by police activity because they know that their buddies and their friends who they meet every day and they see every day are in normal work can get punished. And I think that this kind of made me focus in on deaths where medical examiners are shown to be part of the problem, and that the medical examiners perhaps have to be separated from police. We have to be able to be equally available, for example, to the police, to the prosecutor, as to the district attorney. Medical examiners the defense attorneys won't talk to defense attorneys, for example, whereas we're always talking to the district attorney. We have to be independent. Science is independent of guilt or innocence friendships. If death shows that a friend killed somebody, we got to say that. If it shows that a bad guy was innocent in a certain thing, it doesn't show innocent, but didn't do harm as charged, we have to say that. And we have to be guided by science and not by friendship. And the point is, we grow up with being friends with police and district attorneys that we go in New York City. When I was in New York City, we would go 3 or 4 afternoons a week. There were 2,000 homicides a year in those days, to the different boroughs to give grand jury testimony, to explain to the district attorneys what the autopsy means. The autopsy is not self-explanatory. There are all kinds of things, just like a legal document is not necessarily clear to me as a non-lawyer. And I think that one of the things that the defense attorneys, especially was deaths involving the police, are afraid to consult with the medical examiners, because they know from experience that the medical examiners might tell the district attorney what our theories of the case are, kind of thing. So that there's a sharp division between prosecutors and district attorney and defense attorneys in investigating a case. Instead of being cooperative, everybody's looking for what just the science says.
We just learned via email yesterday from CrimeCon that you're going to be attending CrimeCon. We're very excited about that. But in addition to CrimeCon, what is next for you in terms of projects?
I do some teaching and lecturing, but largely writing. And part of my writing actually is professional writing. That is, to review an autopsy, doing private work, reviewing deaths, and increasing number of deaths have been coming to my attention during police activity. And to be able to figure out on a case-by-case basis what the facts are in a matter, to be able to testify to a jury, which I try to do. It doesn't matter which side calls me, I'm going to say the same thing. And that's what it should be. It's hard to do that sometimes, but there's no individual project. Unlike I think most of my classmates from medical school now are retiring in Florida to avoid the taxes, and playing golf. I never understood golf as that, and I like what I'm doing. So that's why, and the miracle of how the body functions.
We're so glad that you're still at it and still advocating for victims of violent crime and for calling it the way you see it and the science tells you to see it.
Thank you. And it's a fascinating profession, and it needs a lot more forensic pathologists. There aren't enough forensic pathologists because people don't want to go into testify in court and have some guy criticize you. One side's going to love you and one side's going to criticize you. Doctors aren't used to being criticized and saying, you mean to say that? That's not true, that the bullet didn't go that way, and the way the police say it went the way my client says. And that creates hostilities, but we get thick skin.
The book is American Autopsy, One Medical Examiner's Decades-Long Fight for Racial Justice in a Broken Legal System. That is available now at all of your local book retailers. And we do encourage you to shop independent bookstores whenever possible.
Thank you. You guys are easy to talk to.
Oh, this was wonderful.
Did it go okay? Because maybe I deviated too much from the question.
No, not at all. This was great. And I just wanted to say, when I was reading it the other day, your chapter about the Attica prison riots was interesting. Like, my jaw was on the floor. I had no idea about any of what you'd written about the Attica prison riot. It was so cool to read.
Yeah, and that was at that time, I started out initially in college. I was on the school editor of the school newspaper, and I wanted to be a journalist, go into journalism. My mother wouldn't let me. She wanted me to be a doctor. And at that time, there were 15 daily newspapers in New York City, in the 5 boroughs, so there were plenty of jobs for journalists. One of the things that blew my mind was when I went to Attica and saw all the prisoners, the New York Times, on page 1, lead story, said that 8 guards' necks were cut by the hostages, by the inmates. Mm-hmm. And I could see when that was wrong. They were all shot by friendly fire.
Mm-hmm.
Wow.
Said, how could the New York Times get this wrong? And that has always been in my mind.
I read that. I was like, oh my God, that is crazy. This has been really interesting. It's like, here's American history from the point of view that it should be read from.
Yeah.
Which I really enjoyed. So I'm going to bring this with me to CrimeCon, and I hope you'll autograph it for me, sir.
Oh, I would.
Me too.
I would be honored to do that. It's great now that I know what you guys look like.
No, we'll track you down.
Are you going to be wearing those things around your ears, or
no? But we will have lanyards with our names on them, and no, we will make a point of seeking you out. It's so wonderful to talk with you.
You're in Connecticut?
I'm in Connecticut, and then Kristin's in Virginia.
Yeah.
And because are you working in Connecticut?
Yeah, we're in beautiful Norfolk, Connecticut, in the northwest corner, about 2 hours and 15 minutes north of New York City.
That can be beautiful. I have a lot to do with Henry Lee.
Oh, yeah. We've met Dr. Lee.
Police chief for a while.
Yeah.
He's still going strong.
He's amazing. We've enjoyed him immensely.
We actually were able to have dinner with him at Savannah Crime Expo this past year. Like, of all the tables in the room, he just sat down with us and was like, would you like to talk about forensics? And we were like, yeah.
Yeah.
Was his wife with him?
She was.
And Angela.
She's lovely.
She just wrote a book.
Wow.
She wrote a book someplace that was interesting. About the deaths in Croatia.
Uh-huh.
In fact, I got the book and they have a picture on the cover of it. And I'm on that picture. Henry Lee doing a dig or something, and there are a couple of people next to him. Yeah. And it was a photo taken when we were in Croatia, when they were digging up bodies of people who were improperly buried there.
Yeah.
And I have to read it then.
I guess so.
Okay.
So we'll look forward to seeing you in a couple of months at CrimeCon.
Yeah, I really do. And thank you, and all best. And maybe we can have a bite together.
Absolutely.
Great.
Sounds great.
Okay, but now I have to figure out how to turn this off.
It should be a big red button. That's going to do it for this episode of Mind Over Murder. Thank you so much for listening. We'll see you next time.
Mind Over Murder is a production of Absolute Zero and Another Dog Productions.
Our executive producers are Bill Thomas and Kristin Dilley.
Our logo art is by Pamela Arnois.
Our theme music is by Kevin MacLeod.
Mind Over Murder is distributed in partnership with Crawl Space Media.
You can follow us on Facebook, Twitter, or Instagram.
You can also follow our page on the Colonial Parkway Murders on Facebook.
And finally, you can follow Bill Thomas on Twitter at BillThomas56.
Thank you for listening to Mind Over Murder.